Good morning. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Mara Carlin. I am the Acting Director of Strategic Studies here at SAIS. I am not Elliot Cohen, as you can probably tell, but I try on occasion to be him. So on behalf of the School of Advanced International Studies and the Applied Physics Lab, I'd like to welcome you to SAIS. I want to extend a personal thank you to our Dean, Vali Nasser, and to the Johns Hopkins University trustees, Heather Murrin and Sarah O'Hagan, for bringing this terrific program to SAIS. In the spirit of what the university's president calls One University, this program is an effort to bring together the very best that Johns Hopkins has to offer. Its brilliant technical expertise, practical policy know-how, and thoughtful strategic analysis of solutions to the nation's most important challenges today and tomorrow. So we're here to discuss some of those challenges in a paper titled A Preface to Strategy. Among the paper's authors are senior distinguished leaders in military and government service, and a few of them are SAIS alumni. I won't introduce them all, but I will note about half of them have been or are my boss, and so I think very highly of all of them. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to SAIS, and I'd like to turn it over to Ralph Cemil, Director of the Jeju Applied Physics Lab, who will formally introduce all of them. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. Thanks, Mara. And let me thank all of our SAIS colleagues for having us here today. Dean Vali Nasser and I have been talking about engagements between APL and SAIS for some period of time now. And we've noted in particular that there's an increasing overlap in various areas of interest that both of our institutions have. But I note that the paper that we're going to be discussing today is actually a rather different sort of contribution for the Applied Physics Laboratory, which, if you don't know, is the nation's largest university-affiliated research center. But different as that contribution may be, we believe it's an important one. And even though APL is an organization that's focused on the development of game-changing technologies, we're a highly technical organization, it's important for our scientists, our engineers, our analysts to step back periodically and think about the potential strategic impacts that our research and development activities have. And conversely, we have to consider, again periodically, the nation's values and strategies as we think about new research and development initiatives and programs. But how do we do that is a question we asked ourselves in such a complex world. And it's exactly the question that we asked of our senior fellows. Now, just so you know, for a little bit of background, we established the Senior Fellows Program a number of years ago to help APL better understand and guide our work as we go about solving many of the nation's most complex technical challenges. And today we're fortunate to have 11 senior fellows at APL, and these are individuals, as Mara said, who have dealt with some of the thorniest issues facing our nation and have led at the highest levels of government. In fact, one of our senior fellows who helped early on with the development of the paper is Mike Griffin, who of course now serves as the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. And so our senior fellows are here today to share a preview of the answer to the question that we originally posed in this paper that we call A Preface to Strategy. And we've shared this paper with a number of senior leaders in national security, including current government and military officials, and we're encouraged by the very positive responses that we've received about the paper. And we're fortunate today to have many of our senior fellows with us, and I'd like to recognize and thank them for their contributions to the nation, to APL, and today in particular for this paper that you're about to hear about. And so I'd like to just publicly acknowledge them here, and if we could have the ones that are in the audience, please stand. We have John Allen, okay, Lisa Disbrow, Sam Locklear, and Paul Stockton. Thank you all for joining us. A few folks couldn't be here with us today, Jim Gosler and Jim Stavridis, and I don't think Phil DePoy, who was supposed to be here, was able to make it, so Phil couldn't make it. And then finally on stage, we have Avril Haines, Jim Miller, Bob Work, and Richard Danzig. All of these folks are well known to the community. And a special thanks to Richard in particular for penning what is really a beautiful document, as you'll see when you have a chance to read it. And thanks to Christine Fox, who spearheaded this bold effort, and our senior fellows. And so with that, without further ado, let me turn it over to Richard Danzig. Thank you. Okay.
Well, thank you all for being here, especially the students who managed to make it, because I know you have exams tomorrow. You should feel free to crib anything you like from this document to your answers. I felt good about this paper and the group process that generated it until I saw that Christine Fox, who was central to this, has managed to pick a seat as far away from the stage as possible, save one row. But it really is unusual in that it's a group product. Group products are not uncommon in Washington, but they're frequently, particularly when they're strategy documents, characterized by open warfare between the participants, as each tries to push the particular point of view of the constituency that they come from. This was a different, very collaborative effort in which the 11 of us would get together and debate drafts and try and come to a common view. I never expected at the beginning that it would actually produce unanimity, and that it has, I think, is an encouraging characteristic of this. All 11 of us came to agree. Because Hopkins APL is a very mathematical place, I figured that they have 11 senior fellows because it's a prime number. And we tried to here produce a sort of prime outcome. The paper comes in 4 sections, and the 4 of us who are speaking are each going to talk about a different section. I'll talk first about the premises section. Bob Work will talk about major changes to these premises. Averill will talk about the strengths of the United States, and Jim Miller will conclude by talking about the implications of the analysis. We're each going to take 6-7 minutes to do that. In talking about the premises, I want to emphasize this is an unusual paper, not just in the character of the group that produced it, but also in its angle of approach. The approach that is typical for national security strategy documents is to talk about threats and therefore be immersed in discussion about adversaries and talk about then the requirements that might be derived from those threats, what we have to do to meet them. We started in a different place. The emphasis on this document is on American strengths, and it proceeds to emphasize our opportunities. It becomes, therefore, a somewhat optimistic document. It winds up talking about adversaries because inevitably we have to do that. Potential competitors are a critical part of the equation. But they're not the be-all and the end-all, and our focus is on us. Because that focus is on us, we start with what might be thought to be history, which is a discussion of the world as it was conceived when our national security establishment was largely shaped at the end of World War II in the period 1945, 1947, and up from there. We do this not because we think history is some extraordinary guide to the future, but because we can use history in a different way, which is to try and understand why we think what we think, and then go back and analytically rethink that in light of the changed premises. So some of the things that were striking to us is that in the period after World War II, we think strategic decision makers tended to think naturally about 4 domains of warfare: the air, the sea, the undersea, and the land. But in fact, you can see that though they had, of course, some awareness of possible significance of space and the electromagnetic spectrum, we now tend to think in different terms, in terms of 6 different spectra. And Bob will talk 6 different domains. Bob will talk some about this. Those decision makers also, though, naturally thought about military conflict as the core of national security coming out of the World War II experience, and with the emerging threat of the Soviet Union, they thought about militaries as the prime units that would naturally influence or pose risk to us. They also thought about cross-border incursions as the natural forms of attack. In this context, they thought, understandably, that the Atlantic and the Pacific were these extraordinary buffers that provided protection to the United States. They thought centrally, we believe, about technology and U.S. technological and manufacturing superiority. It was reasonable in that time frame to think that manufacturing, the U.S. manufacturing establishment, which had produced this extraordinary victory over the Axis powers in World War II, would remain the central bulwark of American resources. We produced some 100,000 airplanes in the last year of World War II, and the assumption was that, of course, that would endure. U.S. economic power was presumed. It was naturally expected, we believe, that the United States would return to its classic circumstance of a creditor nation with its own debt at classic levels of sort of half of GDP. All these things, of course, have changed in a variety of ways, and their implications are complicated. But our central point is, if you grasp the underlying premises, then you begin to see how our national security establishment in its institutions, in its strategy, and in its processes, all is built from that set of premises, and how they continue to have momentum as we go forward, particularly because one of the phrases in our paper is, nothing seduces like success. We've had such extraordinary success. We not only won World War II, but we also triumphed over the Soviet Union, and that reinforced the tendency to think that we had the Holy Grail. One of these other premises was that the United States government would be the driver of technology development. And among the changes that we know, the two that I'd like to focus on before passing the stage to Bob are that, in fact, the nature of that technology dominance has shifted, and the nature of our economic dominance looks different. And these have big implications for us in a national security, in the evolution of our national security thinking. The technology change is, I think, evident in the tsunami of technology developments that we're seeing globally, and it's a critical point that it is global. This technology first is no longer dominantly controlled by the U.S. government in the way that it might have been expected to be. As we move through the 50s and 60s, we had a world in which U.S. R&D was basically from the government equal to or greater than from the private sector. By the 70s and 80s, that begins to change, and now we have something like 2 times as much R&D in the U.S. private sector as we do from the government sector. On top of that, we have, as all of us have noted, this extraordinary dispersion of technology globally. The spread of the diffusion of this technology as it applies both commercially and to warfare is very rapid. And because so much of it is commercially intertwined in dual-use activities, that phenomenon is abetted. It is also abetted by the economic shift. At the end of World War II, we were in an extraordinarily unusual circumstance. The U.S. has half the world's GDP, and it collects the scientists, et cetera, from around the globe. If you go back to the 1930s, when America was in depression, it's also the case then that some commentators, the contemporary eminent French physicist commented when asked about physics in America, he said, there are no physicists in America. Historically, in the 18th and 19th century, America was nature's nation. We were so blessed with our natural resources, a comment that, or a circumstance that Averill will talk about. But by the 20th century, we become, in our minds and the minds of the world, technology's nation. We are technocratically capable, and we use that technology then as a means to offset the Soviet Union's manpower advantages and the like. We now confront a more normal world in terms of that technology distribution, and we also find ourselves still an extraordinarily preeminent economic power with 1/4 of the world's GDP. But 1/4 of the world's GDP is not the same as having a half. There's a much more normal world out there in terms of dispersion, and that in turn affects strategic power. GDP is by no means the only means of measurement, and it doesn't translate naturally into military power, and there's all kinds of problems as a measure, and we note some of these. But the fundamental fact is that the nature of the equation has changed in this domain. China is predicted, as you well know, to equal the U.S. in GDP sometime over the next decade. Even more striking from my standpoint, the predictions, if one projects out, they're always questionable, but they're indicative, is that by 2050, China will have GDP 50% greater than ours. So this means, among other things, that strategies of spending in order to dominate strategically and in national security are no longer likely to be as successful as in the past. As others have pointed out, we have never confronted a nation in modern times with more than 30 to 40% of our GDP. Nazi Germany didn't have it, the Soviet Union didn't have it. So in conclusion, I think you can read about a number of other premises that we think are important and worth talking about, but you'll see in the report that our analysis suggests that there were a set of premises that underlie everything that is now in our heads, that every national security actor in the course of his or her lifetime grew up with, that shaped the nature of our institutions and our processes. And these processes and strategies are now open to question as the premises themselves shift. So it's worth spending some more time on other premises that are important in this context, and my colleague Bob Work will pick up the story.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Richard has given you an overview of our national security establishment's inherited propositions and predispositions. And I'd like to start by quoting the paper that the group said, "We argue that almost all of these propositions need revision, a majority should be discarded, and it may well be that none can be sustained." Now, the preface makes this argument by identifying 8 key shifts, which we call tectonic shifts, and Richard has talked about 2 of them. One is under the rubric of the erosion of America's economic preeminence, and with it, its security. And the second is what we refer to as an autocatalytic and exponential technology innovation and diffusion. I'm going to discuss another 5, and Avril will finish it up with the 8th in her section. So the next circumstances that is undermining our inherited premises is what we refer to as the expansion of geography in the domains of warfare. Strategists have often remarked, and Richard said that, look, our rise to a superpower was helped in no small way by the fact that we had friendly neighbors to our north and our south, and broad oceanic expanses to our east and west. And this afforded us what we considered to be enormous strategic depth. And this was a premise that in many ways the homeland was going to be a sanctuary for us, and it allowed us to project power overseas without fear of direct attack on our citizens or our territory. Now, during the Cold War, of course, the advent of intercontinental bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles started to undermine this very premise, and it continues to, our splendid isolation continues to be threatened by new strategic cyber attacks, terrorism, terrorist attacks on the homeland, and potentially strategic bioweapons. So as a result, the premise of overseas battlefields that are confined by geography overseas with a defined front and rear no longer pertains. And because we are the most open society in the world and probably depend more on information, the free flow of information, as well as global communications, we have in many respects shifted from being one of the most secure nations within our territory to being one of the most vulnerable. Moreover, whenever the U.S. projects power, the dominance the United States has often enjoyed in these operating domains that Richard talked about, long dominant in air, sea, undersea, and land. But it's been challenged by the development of new operating domains, space, cyberspace, and now near space, the realm where hypersonics operate. Now, the former development challenges our operational organizations, the regional combatant commanders, who are focused on defined geographic areas of responsibility. And the latter really challenges our services, who organize, train, and equip the military that are provided to the geographic commanders to do the duty that the President tells them to do. And they are still largely focused on these traditional eras. I mean, the Department of the Navy, obviously the sea and under the sea, as well as the interface between the sea and land, the Air Force on the air and space, and the Army on the land. Now, the recent elevation of cybercom and the vibrant debate going on right now about the Space Command or Space Force and how it should be formed gives us hope that things are changing. But in our view, these premises still enfranchise and privilege these 20th century priorities. And I would recommend that you read Appendix 2, which is about cyber and our concerns about how the nation is having a hard time struggling with cyber and what it means for national security. The next big change is the development of seemingly continuous and pervasive warfare. The all-volunteer force that we enjoy today and think is the best force in the world by far was based on the premise that the U.S. would rarely be at war. It was built for, what Andy Krepanevich would say, the AVF was built for sprints. It wasn't necessarily built for marathons. And since the end of the Cold War, it's remarkable to me that the United States has been at war more than it's been at peace, and we've been in continuous combat operations since, of course, September 2001, 17 years of war. And this has helped make warfare a background fact of our lives. Many of our citizens don't really pay attention to it, but I guarantee you it consumes the Department of Defense and the services. And it's prompted, inevitably, the services and the departments to be more focused on near-term readiness and demands than it is on long-term readiness and demands, which are the very, very things that we believe we should be most focused on. We've become numb to the persistent and pervasive cyber attacks on our country, on our economy, on our electoral systems, as well as our allies. And this, we think, primarily because the attacks haven't been as dramatic as an overt kinetic attack. They have been corrosive in nature and will continue to be corrosive unless we as a nation can figure out how better to respond to them. Now, even as war has become more pervasive and kind of a background in our very way of life, we've witnessed the decline in the power of traditional power of militaries. And you can just look at the problems we have had overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan, Syria, to say, look, our military now has the ability to apply violence more than any other military in history. And the professional capabilities of our forces are just unbelievable. But the last 17 years of warfare lay bare the problems we have in using military power to address these new national security challenges. It's less able to make and remake or even keep order to the world order that we've built. So the implication, and this comes directly on the heels of what Richard said, we can't spend our way out of this problem. It's very hard for us to conceive that we're going to be able to meaningfully address these 21st century challenges through traditional military investments alone. Now, Richard's talked about the erosion of our economic supremacy. It undermines many, many of the premises that undergird our thinking on national security. And this has happened at the very same time, and as a result, quite frankly, of the immense growth in international trade, finance, and economic interdependence. Now, this happy circumstance is a direct result of what American leaders did after World War II, and the world, under any measure, no matter how you look at it, has benefited from an exponential growth in trade, international travel, and global movement of capital. And we assert that alongside the ability of the United States to be able to project power to secure its interest in our allies, the greatest factor for peace since World War II has been the rise in global prosperity. Now, this creates fundamental challenges to many of the premises that you'll read in the paper, specifically about the independence of our manufacturing and innovation base, and the fact that we are now so dependent on global supply chains. We're so dependent on broad links of raw material and workforces in other countries. And we have lost manufacturing capability, without question. And that is a source of national power that has been treasured by our predecessors and continues to be treasured, especially by the president. So the other thing that we see very, very interestingly is multinational corporations sometimes have views of national security that are orthogonal to what we would consider to be. And I think Google's decision to withdraw from Project Maven is an indicator of this. So the reality is that no matter how we do this, the U.S. now depends on assets and relationships that are outside the United States. We're less reliant on what we directly control. And we don't go as far as embracing the idea of mutually assured economic destruction, but we do believe that this economic investment pushes us towards peace. Now, the final change I want to talk about is clarity about our global primacy, but confusion about our purpose. We actually spent a lot of time debating this particular change. The United States remains the leader of the free world, and what is changing, though, is the clarity of what our purpose is in doing that. We actually thought that one of the reasons why we are continuing along the predispositions that we have grown so accustomed to is because we're so used to them. All of us grew up under these predispositions, and it's very, very difficult for us to automatically reject them. So we asked ourselves what would animate America's engagement in the world, and the paper asked some questions, which we lead to the reader to kind of ponder and answer. We do not try to answer all these questions. We simply note that they must be answers in order to develop the new premises for national security that we think are absolutely incredible. And while we did not address this explicitly as a group, we recognize the widely held triumphalist assumptions that democracy would sweep the world and the open liberal economic model would become the model in a rules-based international order just hasn't proven true, at least not yet. And so sustained support for both of these would be the biggest obstacle to the resurgence and spread of authoritarian and totalitarian regimes in which we are now locked in a competition for global influence. And this is a very important one. So together, Richard and I have described 7 of the 8 tectonic changes. Avril will describe the 8th, which is the erosion of domestic consensus and effective governance, even as she highlights what we believe are the foundations of our national security. Avril?
I don't think I'm tall enough for this group, but putting that aside. No, I first just want to thank SAIS for hosting us and really to thank Ralph and Christine and Richard as our fearless leaders and all of my fellow fellows in this effort. It's really been a remarkable experience throughout this whole piece. So as Bob said, they left the last one to me on the changes, the erosion of a domestic consensus, and probably because I feel so passionately about it, and I think, honestly, it's one of the more frustrating of all of the changes that we see. From my perspective, the divisions along party, ideology, socioeconomic, cultural lines, geography, race, gender, religion, have never been really deeper. And in many respects, they lead to essentially this erosion of domestic consensus that we've seen over the last 70 years, trust and deference given to governmental leaders and particularly elected leaders has really just plummeted. And the unity of the country in thinking about and implementing a strategy for national security has also been diminished. And as we look at that, I mean, I think one of the most obvious examples of that is, as is currently occurring, the problems passing a budget, for example, on a regular, normal process, the way we have to go through a crisis to continuing resolution in this case. And you see how that affects national security, and it's just one example of how the erosion of domestic consensus can do that in a really quite significant way. And another example I think we lived through was our response to, for example, Russian interference in an election, and how the partisan politics really took a bite out of our ability to essentially address that issue. So I see this as being a critical aspect. And as we shifted from the changes, essentially, to think about the strengths, one of the key points that Jim will be ultimately talking about is that we believe that these new premises that would underpin a national strategy, essentially, for national security, really need to recognize these changes that we've identified, that really Bob has gone through the vast majority of, but also build on the critical strengths that we see in the country. And we see these as ones that really will help us to function more effectively in a national security space. So, as Richard really noted at the outset, this is not a risk-based strategy. We're focused instead on assessing our strengths and what they can help us to achieve. And we believe, frankly, that we should protect and expand and use these strengths, right? And that they're often, the key risks to those strengths come not from outside external threats, but rather from internal threats. But as we listed our strengths, we wanted to be clear about the fact that we don't see these as uniquely American strengths. We recognize that other countries have many of these strengths, but we believe these to be sort of in combination, coherently, our American strengths. And the first one that I see is sort of most, it's sort of at the top of the list from my perspective, is American values. And I think when we looked at it, we talked about American values reflected in our founding documents, the value that government should reflect the will of the people, but also that government should respect and protect critical principles such as equality, human dignity, liberty, the pursuit of happiness for all. And these values, they make us stronger. They're principles around which we cohere. They're principles that inspire us. And they not only inspire us, but they also inspire other countries when they look at the United States, as is quoted, the sort of shining city on the hill. And we think about this, and I personally find that these are the things that inspire me as an American citizen. And perhaps that's odd in the sense that I was not one of the people that the Founding Fathers was talking about when they described equality and the principles that I've described in many respects, and yet these are principles that endure, and in fact, the unlikely career path that I had led me to a place where I could see how those principles ultimately created an America that lived up to the promise that I believed it could be. And I really think that's a critical piece of what we hope to see built on for a new national security strategy in the future. And we wanted to put it first to really recognize the importance of that strength. So the second one is the settled system of governments that we talk about. And we say for 2.25 centuries, we've had a continuous governance structure, right? And that we have a kind of a rough consensus on the rules and boundaries of that structure. And as a consequence, we don't really waste time on relitigating the Constitution and the way we see some other countries do, and spend a lot of time and effort on these issues. But I also see it as so critical to maintain, essentially, that consensus on the rules and boundaries of the structure that we have. And it's certainly one of the things that we just think about as being incredibly important to the functioning of the United States government, the institutions, the way we work effectively, and the way we know that we have to intersect in order to actually come together to, for example, implement a national security strategy. The third one we talk about, the third strength, is human capital of the United States. And in many respects, this is not unrelated to, for example, American values. Here we talk about the character, the generosity, the quality of the people that we work with and that embody our citizenship, and we see it as a key strength. But in order for it to be maintained as a key strength, we really need to nurture, essentially, our human capital. And one of the things we talk about in that section is the level of inequality in the country, and the idea that essentially people have to see that if they work hard and they do what they expect, will bring them value in society, that they have to see that value, that they should be recognized for that value, that we have to bring along the entire franchise, in a sense, in order to recognize and see the great potential, essentially, of what the United States can be through its people. And we also talk about immigrants in that space. We talk about the extraordinary contributions that people who were not born in the United States but came to the United States and joined the United States as citizens or ultimately or as green card holders and longtime permanent residents have contributed in the defense field, whether it be in aerospace or in nuclear science or in other areas, but also who have served in our military and have been a part of defending the country and protecting all of these other strengths that we talk about. Then we also, as the fourth one, talk about America's physical advantages. And in many respects, it's a shifting landscape. It's not exactly the same as the assumption that we started with, but it is nevertheless still a critical strength of the United States. We talk about the fact that we're the world's largest exporter of agricultural products, but also just the remarkable resources that we have in the United States in oil and gas and other spaces, and how valuable that is essentially to our strengths, not just in the economic space, but in the national security space, and how interrelated these are in many respects. And that brings me to the fifth strength that we talk about, which is economic engine of the United States. So the economy, people will talk about debt and consider the potential for disruption to the labor market as a consequence of artificial intelligence and other fears that people have. But I think it's really pretty well and broadly accepted that the strength of the United States, one of the key strengths is our economics, right? And the extraordinary economy that we have. I mean, I think one of the figures that we talk about is that Americans create more than $2 billion of value every hour, but there's lots of different metrics by which we measure this. And I think it is one of those spaces where, at least over a period of my career, I've seen economics continually be further integrated into how we think about our national security and the enormous influence that we can have through this space in essentially affecting what we believe to be in the interest of the United States. And then the sixth one we talk about is America's position in a favorable international order. And I think this is post-war American leaders really led the design of, the investment in, really an array of institutions, treaties, norms, legal frameworks to facilitate the collaboration, the pursuit of peace and security, prosperity, to promote our values throughout the world, in a sense. And the U.S. really secured a key role in these institutions and in these frameworks and has relied on these frameworks for decades to further our interests in these different areas. And it's not to say that this international order isn't going to go through significant changes in light of all of the other changes that we've talked about, but rather that we shouldn't be throwing it out necessarily, but actually thinking about how to evolve it in a way that continues to strengthen what it is that we intend to do from a national interest perspective, because we have seen great value come out of that international order, and we believe that it will continue to play a critical role in any national security and foreign policy strategy that you would see in the future. And then finally, I come to America's military forces and intelligence community. And here, I think it's very hard to imagine my having to argue this point with this audience, but our military and our national security professionals generally, including the intelligence community, protect and defend the country against existential threats. And I think, as Bob noted, really nobody argues about the extraordinary strength of our military and our capacity to defend ourselves in a sense, but it really is clear that it's not the only piece that has to be brought to bear to defend ourselves, and yet it is an absolutely critical strength that we also shouldn't lose track of in this process. And we work through just extraordinary different domains, as we've talked about: land, air, on sea, undersea, in space, in the electromagnetic spectrum, including cyberspace, so in all of these different areas. And upon those strengths, we hope to build essentially what would be the premises of a new national security strategy. And so we'll talk about the new premises with Jim. Thank you very much.
First of all, Mara, thank you and SAIS for hosting us today. Really appreciate it. And I also want to extend thanks to Ralph and Christine, who encouraged and supported this project, and to particularly our lead author, Richard Danzig, as well as our other senior fellows. So what you've heard so far is that there have been tectonic changes that have undermined the strategic premises on which our past national security strategies have been founded, that these changes are likely to continue for the future. And it sounds perhaps to an unpracticed ear that is a little bit negative. Fundamentally, this is a positive document, and as you read it, you'll get that sense, but it's grounded in reality. And we want to be sure that we start with that reality as we consider where things stand. I want to talk about three broad sets of implications for this assessment. I've real jumped into the middle of the first one. And the first one is about what our national security objectives should be as a nation. So as you think about this as a preface to strategy and informing, hopefully, discussion among the public, in Congress, in this administration, and in upcoming elections, say first question is, what should be the strategic objectives of a national security strategy? And we're arguing that it should not be first and foremost take on China or respond to Russia or et cetera. Those are important considerations. But first and foremost, our national security strategy should be understanding our strengths, building our strengths, and part of that understanding is to know that they are at risk today. So when we think about American values, a key source of our credibility and power overseas as well as our own domestic tranquility is based on those values. Those are under challenge today, both domestically and overseas. So build on our strengths, and to reiterate, our values, the stability of our governance, the security of our population, international system, our economy, our human capital, our military and intelligence capabilities. All of these are fundamental, all of these are at risk, and investing in these will take time, innovation, and resources, and will require hard choices as well. So that's broad set of implications. One, focus on our strengths first and foremost, build on those, understand they're at risk, and we need to tend to those. Second set of implications are about the economy and about technology. And let me make four broad points. The annexes that we've talked about cover innovation and cyber, as well as new modes of cooperation, possibly even with our strongest competitors. And I'll touch on a couple of examples, but there are many more on the annex to the paper. First is easier said than done, but within the military and intelligence community, as well as more broadly, we need to innovate faster, we need to invest smarter. Easy to say, harder to do. The annex on innovation in particular, I would encourage you to have a look at it on this topic. But just as an example, within the military and intelligence sphere, that means more wargaming, which Bob Work, as Deputy Secretary, was a big advocate of, more red teaming, more competitive analysis, more use of a technique called horizon scanning. It also means understanding that our competitors will surprise us sometimes. We are not the final word. The enemy or the adversary or the competitor will have a vote, and whether it's in the economics realm or whether it's in the military sphere, we need to be prepared for that, and we need to work better to anticipate, and even more importantly, to practice adapting rapidly. Second, we need to prioritize defending Americans on American soil and our critical infrastructure. As we think about the steps taken since 9/11, huge improvements in the civil aviation that reduced the risk of someone hijacking an airplane and flying it into a building or otherwise taking it down to do damage. The biggest two areas we have where we need to focus attention, and the report draws some highlight to these, is on biosecurity, where Richard Danzig in particular has written extensively in the past, and on cybersecurity. Both of these threats, on the one to our population, the other to our critical infrastructure, are real. Both of them can go not only to other major actors, other great states, but also to smaller nations and to individuals. And finally, in this category of thinking about economy and technology, and just understand I'm hitting a few of the key points, not the entire report here. We need to identify weapon systems, personnel investments, and strategies that no longer justify their investment. We can't buy our way to security. We're going to have to make hard choices, and that is difficult to do, but we need to disinvest in some areas, even as we invest in others. Now, our report highlighted a couple of areas where there was agreement. And for example, if you think about our competition in the air domain, investing heavily in fourth-generation short-range aircraft that are manned and have therefore limited ability to stay aloft, as compared to longer range, stealthy, and unmanned in general, is a pretty straightforward trade. We need to turn the dial on that. And as we think about the competition with other great powers, in particular in the sea and undersea, we are continuing to invest and indeed plan to grow the Navy surface fleet. And at the same time, our fleet of submarines has gone down, and we are underinvesting in undersea unmanned vehicles. So the second of three broad sets of implications is about economics and about technology. And I've given you the high-level points there. And we need to turn the dial on innovation. We need to turn the dial on making hard choices. The third and final category I want to talk about briefly is thinking about conflict, cooperation, and competition with great power competitors. In particular, I'm thinking, and the report is talking about China and Russia. U.S. strategy has to prepare for the potentiality of conflict, of course. That's what deterrence is based on, the credible ability to apply military force to defend our interests, to defend our allies and territories. At the same time, there are fundamental areas of cooperation with Russia, with China. In the past, it's included counterterrorism, it's included counterproliferation, fighting against weapons of mass destruction. And even as we prepare for the potential for conflict and look to reinforce our deterrence posture vis-a-vis China and Russia, we need to look to these areas of cooperation. So those areas in the past, counterterrorism, counterproliferation, we think in particular future space missions, where we've seen significant cooperation in the past, including with Russia and China, and combined efforts to combat disease as well. So there are fundamental areas of cooperation, even against our strongest competitors and potential adversaries. Secondly, we need to maintain U.S. military and intelligence expertise within each of the domains that we've talked about, including space, cyberspace, electromagnetic spectrum, as well as the traditional domains. It doesn't mean that we need to invest equally in each of them. Again, as an example, in areas where we have a competitive advantage, undersea versus surface of the sea, for example, we need to make preferential investments and hard choices. In areas where we have critical societal vulnerabilities, including to our critical infrastructure, to cyber attack, we need to make investments as well. We don't have an infinite budget. We have a significant budget as a nation, and we need to prioritize and focus. And third, we need to better coordinate what we do. Avril, this goes back to your role as Deputy National Security Advisor, a fundamental challenge of integrating the various tools of national power. In some instances, we've done it effectively as a nation. We're advantaged by the fact that we don't have a centrally planned economy. We don't have a centrally planned Politburo directing what our people do, or indeed what our government does. But the coordination within government, and even perhaps more importantly, and a greater challenge today, the coordination between government and the private sector, so-called private-public partnerships, are fundamental. And part of this is going to be understanding the role of private sector entities, not just in research and development, as Richard Danzig talked about, but also in providing platforms that could advance democracy on the one hand, or could hurt our democracy on the other hand. So Facebook, Google, very much in the news literally today as well. And fourth and finally, in this category, in this final category, the United States has, in many instances, taken significant risks in warfare. The authors of this report believe and recommend that as we think about future national strategy, the United States needs to take significant risks also in the pursuit of peace. What does that mean? As one example, it means that the administration's effort to reach out to North Korea to try to achieve a deal that would eliminate their nuclear and missile programs is a smart move, and it's something that is very consistent with the gist of the strategy. I think I probably speak for most, or if not all, of the senior fellows who wrote this. The likelihood of success is not high, and yet it's something that we should pursue. In other areas, we will take risks in potentially sharing advanced technologies if we engage in combined exploration of space with Russia and with China. It's an area where we need to take prudent risk. And so taking some risks to advance peace as well as to prepare for conflict and as well as to compete more effectively is fundamental. These are broad sets of implications. I want to return to the first again to finish, and that is looking at the United States at not just our historic strengths, but our current and potential future strengths. We need to invest there. It starts at home, and it starts with our values and our institutions. They are at risk, and they need protection. And with that, I'll stop, and I think I turn it back to Richard.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So we can take a couple of minutes and squeeze in some questions if someone would like to. Yes, go ahead. We're going to give you a microphone. Actually, before we give you the microphone.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an Intel analyst and a former diplomat. There was, and it's a question about our values, a big picture question. There was a time in which we viewed our national security in the framework of deposing tyrants, emptying gulags, respecting self-determination over territorial integrity. And now everything is stability, 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 stability. And under the stability model, tyrants get worse, they acquire technology, decade after decade, and then at some point your national security is really in bad shape. So I want to ask about that. When do we go back to some earlier values to really secure our national security?
We adopt a position which I think will only half satisfy you. We think we need to be realistic about what's been called regime change, and by and large argue that it's not a good investment, that it doesn't lead to the kinds of results that have been pursued. And this is not just a reference to the Iraq War, but more broadly. We think, though, that we need to recognize that, as we put it in the paper, the appetite of autocratic regimes expands with the eating, and that we need to take a firm set of views, both about articulating our values and about resisting the kind of effort beyond their borders. And it's finding that balance that's an art. Different people will draw it in different ways, but and you'll find more richly textured response in the paper. But that's the kind of balance that we try to strike. I don't know if, go ahead, Jim.
Richard, I would just add on to that, as we, I think, all emphasized, start at home, live our values, show the rest of the world that we mean what we say in how we operate domestically, and that this can be a model for political and economic success for a country, first. Second, work with like-minded nations. Our democratic allies in Europe, for example, have been under the same sort of pressure from Russia, and in some cases even greater pressure than we have through cyberspace and indeed through the infiltration and invasion of little green men and annexation of territory. So supporting like-minded nations, supporting our allies and partners as they work to have their political systems be effective, I believe, are absolutely fundamental.
So more, go ahead, Ava.
Just one addition to that, and I fully agree with it, but I think just to recognize that not everybody will come necessarily to the same conclusions for how it is that you promote your values and what the values precisely should be in a particular circumstance. But I do think that one of the things that we're stating here is that we believe that this is a critical aspect of national security strategy, that this is something that we need to think about as a key strength of the United States, and that having conversations about how it is that you live up to your values is an important piece of the puzzle, in a sense.
So more obviously could be said about this, but I think we might want to get some other issues or questions on the table, and then it's indicative of what we are hoping to trigger in this discussion, that these kinds of issues might get more intensely debated. Go ahead.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. Just looking over the paper here, my question is, various people, for instance, Mr. Schmidt, it's a call for a national crash program in AI. And then other people have said we need a national, massive national, nationally directed program in quantum computers, and so forth and so on. And people hark back to Apollo program as a unifying factor and a lot of technological spin-offs, or a Manhattan Project. It's not clear to me from reading over this what your position is on such calls.
Bob, you want to go first, or you want me to?
As Richard said, we're in a technological tsunami that is quite expansive. And one of the issues is we have not, as a nation, established the priorities that we definitely want to pursue. China has been much more discreet in saying these are the areas that we want to dominate in. And I think this is one of the things that the paper does not explicitly address, but essentially would argue that, look, our strengths are, once we set priorities, we're quite good as a nation in pursuing them. You mentioned the Apollo program and the ICBM program that we put together, et cetera. But we really need to come to an agreement on what is most important. I think everybody on the panel, or all of the authors, might pick a different one. And this is not meant as a criticism. It will sound like one, but is not meant to be. The Department of Defense has 10 R&D priorities. And when you have 10 R&D priorities, all of which are very, very important, are you losing ground in the priorities that really make a difference over time? So what we would argue is you have to force the conversation and get to the priorities and then get after them.
Richard, if I could just add, if you don't mind, if I could add, not subtract from that. If you look at two models, one is a centrally planned model of research and development, and we'll pick winners at the outset. And a second is a more competitive model that is driven by the private sector. My money's on model 2. And although there'll be some friction and confusion and a sense that we don't know exactly where we're going, one of the great virtues of the American system, and in a world where R&D is driven more by the private sector than by the government, is that you have this competition, you have people seeking out opportunity to make a buck, to make a difference. And I'll bet on our system any day. I agree there should be a few select priorities for the government, but between the two systems, I'll take ours any day.
Hank.
Hank Gaffney, 54 years in defense. On values and other things like norms, rules, interest, all of that kind of thing. I'm glad the word interest did not come up. Where do we get the catalog of them? It looks like in this country we have now two completely opposing sets of values. On one side, there's people think everybody should have affordable health insurance. On the other side, people think that the 1% should have all the money and decide what to do with everything. Where do I find all this in some way that I can understand it all?
Do you want to go first, April, or would you like me to?
You want me to take that one? I mean, look, I guess there's sort of, I'll try to take it in a serious way, and the way I think about it is, I think we do have some very core values in the United States that the vast majority of the population, if not everybody, would agree to, right? The devil, of course, is in the details. How do you actually implement some of these values, right? But what I feel is something that's useful to identify on a regular basis and prioritize is the fact that that matters. In other words, so if you talk about values related to equality or human dignity or things along those lines, right? And I think everybody would probably sign up for that in the room, right? So how do you actually implement human dignity, right? But you have to ask the question in the context of your policy in order for you to actually have a chance of actually affecting it. And I think that's a part of what it is that needs to be lifted up. So I think it's hard to argue that there's a value in having the top 1% of the population simply make all of the decisions, right? I'm not sure I've heard anybody suggest that that's a value we should support. So in a way, you kind of answered your own question, which is to say that that's not really a values argument, right? But some of the other things that you mentioned are values arguments. So anyway, that's how I might approach it.
Yeah, I would just add that we're a group of national security professionals, as are you. From a national security standpoint, it matters very little whether we have one position or another position on healthcare. There is historically an ability in this country to unite with respect to national security issues that hugely shaped the worldview of our predecessors. World War II is that extraordinary unification of the country against a dramatic challenge. The Soviet Union, similarly, though there were all kinds of issues about McCarthyism and the like that were contentious. One of the things we address in this paper is what Bob pointed out when he said there's agreement about our primacy, but not such agreement about our purpose. And our view is that our purpose really is the protection of values that we really do share. Those values relating in our attitudes towards the primacy of government or the primacy of people, our sense of freedom of the individual, our sense of the importance of free speech and the like. And amidst all the contention, we can lose track of that. But when we recognize that, they not only define our purpose, which is to resist autocratic regimes that would suppress those, but they also, as Avril's comments suggested, suggest some of our means, which is to emphasize these things as, in fact, instruments for suggesting where we ought to be investing and for persuading others to sign up with us. As with everything else, this is a much larger discussion, but I think we call this paper a preface to strategy because it isn't an answer to all our strategic questions, but it is a preface. And the fact that each of these questions rightly raises fundamental issues is encouraging to us. You'll find in the paper more reason to be encouraged about this debate. With apology, because our time is limited, let's see if we can just squeeze in one or two last questions in the very back.
Hi, Dan Stern, I'm a student here. At various points in the talk, people mentioned innovation and how that's critical for America's technological superiority. I took a glance at the report, and my general sense was that it was sort of used in an output sense, that is, innovation used to develop certain technological capabilities. There was some discussion of human capital, but I was curious, since this is a national security strategy, it's more encompassing than a national defense strategy, where does education play into the role of securing, greater technological innovation, greater research and development, stuff that is really the essence of technological superiority as a strength for the United States?
Good for you. I also admire your great skill in research technique when you say you took a glance at the report, because you said it's a good strategy. You found an important issue here. First of all, we're very assertive about the need for, in general, investing in human capital. We point out how, for example, the GI Bill was an effort towards assisting demobilization, but is in fact hugely important in building our national human capital capabilities, and the support for the all-volunteer forces Bob mentioned is fundamental. But we're also very assertive in the report, and I point you particularly towards Appendix 1 on innovation, that if we're going to be serious about innovation, we need to reduce it from just an abstraction or a pep word to some real stuff. We're quite critical of the way the military manpower system, for example, undervalues technological expertise. If you want to be, as an enlisted person in the military, promoted above mid-level management ranks, you need to move out of your technical specialty. We criticize that kind of lack of investment in human capital in the sense that it discourages that sort of thing. We also, for example, suggest that it's incumbent on civilian leaders to push the notion of innovation much harder. As, for example, we praise a phrase we first heard from Peter Thiel, where you might reasonably ask candidates for 3- and 4-star positions, what do you believe that your peers, that's important, that your colleagues generally don't believe? We want to promote people who have that kind of attitude, so we want to find those people. And there's much other discussion, I think, in there about concretely how to innovate. The U.S. Military is remarkably good at innovating in the face of crisis. And in fact, they're amazingly innovative organizations in meeting the day-to-day mission in the field. But we lose track of the potential over the longer term and the requirement over the longer term. And much of the discussion is about that. So education, as you rightly raised it, is an important part of a larger theme that you'll find quite pointed in the discussion. We take a last question. I apologize just for lack of time, but we're happy to come up here and talk with you all. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline. I'm with Carnegie Mellon University, visiting here in DC. I was wondering if you could talk more about the role of international institutions. I read briefly in the paper that you said we were beneficiaries of it, but there's sort of two sides to the debate now, whether or not we need to pull back from international institutions or have more of a role, and how that will impact what these tectonic shifts are and how we should move forward with international institutions. If you could take more of a stance on that, please.
April? Yeah.
Sure, I'm happy to take a stab at that, and I'm sure others will have something to say on this. I think when I think about this from a national security standpoint, what is utterly clear is the fact that we can't actually protect our national security without engaging internationally, right? I mean, even if you just look at not the sort of typical thing, but pandemics or other issues like that, and I think the intelligence community has indicated that a pandemic that just infects, less than 1% of the population, and actually through respiratory means, kills or injures just a very tiny 1% of that population that it infects. It's going to reach our borders within 6 months, or any place around the world within a very short amount of time. And so you recognize that it's necessary to work with other countries, right? And as a consequence, you don't want to do it in the crisis. You want to actually have an international institution that's capable of managing the issue well before it's at a crisis. And you want to be able to do it in such a way that you're not just detecting and disrupting threats as they're coming at you, although that's important, but also that you want to actually do groundwork prior to it so that places around the world, when a threat emerges, can actually handle it themselves, so that you've actually prevented it from getting to the point where it's going to be heading towards you, right? So I believe there's no question that we need international institutions moving into the future in order to deal with national security threats and issues of all different types, essentially. And then there's the question of, are the international institutions that we have today the right ones, right? In other words, should we just be then investing in them, or do we need to actually do anything else? And I think one of the challenges, it's a case-by-case analysis, essentially. Some of them do work quite effectively, but in general, we haven't been investing in them to the degree that we've been demanding results from them. So we used the World Health Organization when it came to Ebola. We used, the IMF and the World Bank when it came to recessions that we saw around the world. We saw that we've used international institutions for a variety of different purposes, transportation, other things that we've identified in the report. But we're not investing in them the way we used to, and we're not actually reforming them. And part of that has to do with, in a sense, a lack of domestic consensus and a variety of other things that we've seen, where it's very challenging, for example, to get treaties through the Senate now to reform those types of institutions. Many of them were established through treaties. So there's a whole series of challenges that I see, at least in the context of actually dealing with this moving forward. But I do believe that we have to invest in them, and I think we need to reform them as well.
So I would just say also, on top of that, in conclusion, that the paper is a preface to national security strategy, so it speaks in one direction to national security strategists. But in the other direction, it speaks to the American public as a whole. And we do not purport as strategy types, national security types, to have answers to complicated questions like how do you strike the balance on immigration or trade or the support of international institutions. We're cognizant that there are values and issues here that are outside our domain. But what we're trying to emphasize, among other things, is that there is a national security aspect to these, and there are national security consequences. So the international institutions, for example, and the growth of international trade that Bob emphasized in the changes have, for example, lifted hundreds of millions, literally more than 1 billion people out of poverty. And that has huge national security implications. We say that it stands alongside deterrence as the most important factor in international peace. So in your judgment about international institutions or international trade, or for that matter, immigration and other issues that we've talked about, you need to factor in the national security vector in the consideration about those issues. We've tried to be articulate about it. I'm sorry that time doesn't permit us to be more articulate in terms of the questions and answers here, but we'd be happy to talk to people if you'd like to come up, and certainly we encourage you to read the document, and you should feel free as well to correspond afterwards. If it provokes this kind of discussion, we'll be happy. Thank you very much.